I would like to welcome you all to this launch event of the Community Foundation's Insight Hub, an information series that provides you with actionable insight to inform your giving. Powered by the Vermont Community Foundation's experience and research and informed by the lived experience of Vermonters, the Insight Hub offers webinars, events, briefs, and peer-to-peer experiences that help philanthropists understand where their giving can make a difference in Vermont. I'm Fran Stoddard, and today's topic, a year of pandemic. It's been roughly a year since the pandemic took hold, and the Community Foundation launched the VT COVID-19 Response Fund with the belief that philanthropy had a critical role in a critical role to play, certainly in helping communities persist and recover. Within that period, communities have been challenged like rarely before, but the resiliency and kindness of Vermonters shines as bright as ever. Today, we pause and reflect on the millions of dollars raised and granted, on the key decisions that paved the way, and how philanthropy can continue to make the greatest impact on COVID-19 moving forward. We'll be talking to Community Foundation President and CEO Dan Smith, as well as some of his staff leading the COVID-19 response and recovery. We'll also hear from folks in the field who are working on food access, youth engagement, and community and economic development. There will be opportunities for attendees to ask questions. We will have 2 audience Q&As throughout the session, but we encourage you to submit your questions at any point using the Q&A feature that you should see at the bottom of your Zoom window. The chat also shows, but it's been disabled. And of course, this is being recorded and will be posted on vermontcf.org. Additionally, if you think of questions after the webinar concludes, you should feel free to send them to info@vermontcf.org. We begin with Community Foundation President and CEO Dan Smith. So Dan, it's been just over a year of pandemic. Take us back to a year ago. Share a bit about what was happening at the foundation back in March of 2020, as we were all beginning to realize the seriousness of the situation.
Well, thank you, Fran, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon as we take a minute to reflect about the experience of the past year. It's interesting. It seems like every day is a sort of an anniversary and a reminder of all that was uncertain a year ago at this time. We launched our COVID-19 Response Fund on March 13th, 2020, the same day, incidentally, that our entire office went onto remote footing. There's a whole universe of things that weren't clear at that moment that we all didn't know at that point. There was so much uncertainty about how needs were going to manifest, what the public health response was going to look like, where the pandemic was going to land across communities, who it was going to affect, and frankly, how much we would be able to raise in the response effort, what that response would need to look like. And as the weeks progressed, Fran, it was really incredible as the picture got clearer. We knew that there would be a public response, and we knew really quickly that philanthropists were going to be very active, very engaged, and incredibly generous in support of the needs facing Vermonters and Vermont communities. We also knew, and it became crystal clear early, that the first focus was going to be on the basic needs facing Vermonters and driven by the isolation of the pandemic, driven by the crisis of the isolation that was pandemic was forcing on people. It also became quickly pretty evident that Vermont had a handle on the public health pieces of the crisis by virtue of maybe our innate social distance or a strong administrative response. We would have a handle on that piece of the work. But by the same token, we knew that the nature of Vermont's economy, particularly the small town economies that are dependent on hospitality, tourism, and the discretionary spending of people who are no longer traveling, we knew the economic impacts would be dramatic, and most dramatic for low wage, minimum wage, and tip-based workers in the hospitality sector. The question became for us really quickly out of the gate, what is the unique role for a community foundation in this space in a way that will complement the urgency and the timing, or the urgency of the moment, but the timing and the scale of the public response as that played out. We also heard really early on and really directly that the nonprofit sector needed to project a high level of coordination, or it was going to be really challenging to raise what everyone felt like would be necessary to respond at scale in this moment. So these are just a few of the considerations that were playing out in those late days in March and April as the pandemic commenced.
With so much that was unknown back then, how did you even begin to figure out the specifics of what to support first and where?
Well, as I said, out of the gates, it was really clear that there was a crisis in terms of the basic needs manifesting across Vermont communities. And our ability to generate that insight and our understanding came from a strategic shift we'd made over the course of the last few years, really to put a strong emphasis and a priority on the way in which we were engaging in communities across the state, really building strong understanding and strong networks across grantees, across community leaders, across community members, and in every corner of the state. So that insight was populating that focus, and that practice positioned us well to develop insight and develop understanding really quickly at the onset of the pandemic. The second decision we made out of the gate was to build an advisory structure that really coordinated and represented coordination with the nonprofit sector across the state, and included the Vermont Food Bank leadership and John Sales. It included the United Way of Northwestern Vermont, Jesse Bridges, speaking for the United Ways. It included Sue Minter from Capstone Community Action, speaking for the community action agencies. And that advisory structure really allowed us to present and commit to a level of coordination on a statewide basis across the nonprofit sector for the fund. It also included voices of state and federal funders. So we had a good sense of both the timing and direction of public dollars, which would undoubtedly be larger than philanthropy, but also in some ways slower and less nimble. So that advisory structure stood us in good stead over the course of the year as we really sought ways for philanthropy to complement and round out and fill gaps left by the public commitment.
Impressive. So you've talked about how this crisis provides an opportunity to address some of the structural issues that led Vermont to be vulnerable to the disruption caused by the pandemic. Say a little bit more about that.
As we looked out beyond the urgency of the immediate needs that were driven by the pandemic and the isolation, it was clear that the events of March, April, and May of 2020 were landing on communities that were economically insecure, economically and socially fragile. And that again compelled us to ask the question: what are the economic and social weaknesses that are present in those communities that philanthropy and a community foundation can go to work on to highlight and drive the aspiration for us to recover collectively to a higher level of resilience in the long term than was present at the outset of the pandemic. It forced us to bring up questions like, how do we address the disparate experience of the pandemic by race, by work and profession, by class, by educational attainment, by region, and what are the key pieces of work going into those strategies? And it compelled us to ask those questions. Philanthropy is accustomed to working on a lot of little things. And as the economic impacts and social consequences of the pandemic unfurled, our commitment was to not necessarily to go into a lot of little things. We were going to try to seed a few big things deeply and effectively, and try to set the table for a long-term, strong, resilient recovery. And so over the course of June, July, and August of last year, based on our insight, our research, our understanding of the emerging landscape, our relationships across the state, and the feedback we were getting, the insight of our state and nonprofit partners, there were 5 areas that really emerged that seemed fundamental to that higher level of resilience in communities over the long term. As big as the crisis is, we continue to believe it offers a chance to make headway on the conditions that hold people in place, and to emphasize the vulnerabilities of communities that pre-existed the pandemic as the context that made it worse. And our hope is to align philanthropy around those things in this moment.
Okay, so you have these 5 areas that you've prioritized. Can you walk me through that?
Sure. First and foremost, as the pandemic emerged, the gaps in rural connectivity really came home to roost. When kids have to learn online, when doctor's appointments are online, when people are starved for social interaction, the gap in digital access is a clear precondition for long-term community resilience. We've learned really that challenge is twofold. Maybe we were slow to the table on that one, but I think it's crystal clear in terms of that twofold challenge. One is the infrastructure challenge, like getting the connections to the end of the dirt road. The other is the financial challenge, the financial accessibility of access to technology. Can you afford a tablet? Can you afford a laptop? Can you pay a monthly fee for an internet service provider? And the state through philanthropy and public policy, is going to have to get a handle on both aspects of those challenges for us to get become more resilient in the long term. The second area of focus is really around rural entrepreneurship, Fran. The idea of disparate economic activity by region, by place across the state means that for philanthropy, there's an opportunity to seed new business creation, new startups, and the strength of downtowns. And if we can do so, we can be a part of building more resilient communities over time. I think there's a really important lesson coming out of the pandemic that rebuts one of the orthodoxies of business over the last period of decades, and it's that the orthodoxy was that consolidation and concentration and aggregation made a business and an economy stronger. And the reality as we emerge from the pandemic may be from a community standpoint that distribution and disaggregation and spreading out across geography and across places and having a high number of new business creations and a high number of growing businesses creating economic activity is a platform for strength and resilience over a long term. The third area of focus really is around food system resilience, and we're aided in this conversation by our key partners at the High Meadows Fund. But it's another example of where that bias towards concentration at a national and global level really revealed itself to be weaker than we might have thought. The question in this space, and you're going to hear from a key panelist who was instrumental in this effort as a partner in a few minutes, but the two questions really were, how do we pivot our local food system and sustain the lessons of pivoting our local food system into food access and feeding our neighbors with healthy local food? But also in the longer term, how do we ensure that the families and businesses that are working on the land, that are providing that food, that are fostering that level of local security around food access, are able to be economically secure in the long term as well? How can they thrive and be successful in the things that they've chosen to do, on which we need to rely in a pandemic environment, and on which we rely on a daily basis over the course of the year? The fourth area of focus, Fran, was around our demographics, how we create welcoming, equitable, and anti-racist communities. We have an aging population in Vermont. We have negative net migration among 18 to 44-year-olds. We have an overwhelmingly white population. And yet, if you look at the younger generation, it's increasingly diverse. So the question is, how do we position our communities to be places of access, potential, places of opportunities for new Vermonters, both for people who don't currently live here, but those who live here who don't necessarily feel welcome. And there's abundant examples in the news on a near daily, unfortunately, basis for that understanding to take root. In my view, it's less a question of welcoming than it is a question of belonging, and what philanthropy can do to set the stage for communities to which all Vermonters feel like they belong and feel like they have the potential to be economically and socially secure, successful, and have the ability to take care of their families and take care of their neighbors. So we've seeded a strategy that focuses on building anti-racist communities as a mechanism for addressing that long-term demographic challenge, which is an economic thing, but it's also a moral compulsion for us as a state and a set of communities. The final area we focused on was really focusing on learners and transition, really attentive to the dislocated workers disrupted by the pandemic, and also the graduates of high school in the class of 2020, whose future was thrown into an incredible amount of uncertainty, led by the J. Warren and Lois McClure Foundation and their commitment to the class of 2020 early on, when very little was known about what people were going to do or how they were going to react. That commitment was an astounding promise to a class that really changed behavior on a lot of young people and offered some certainty at a time when not much was certain. So we built a strategy addressing that chronic and systemic workforce challenge in Vermont, creating clarity around pathways to education and opportunity across training providers, across educational providers, and with key partners across the state that really changed the landscape of understanding and affordability for the pathways that lead to economic opportunity in Vermont. So with each of these initiatives, the issues underlying them in Vermont communities are systemic. They predate the pandemic. That we were asking the question, what's the role for philanthropy and what's the role for a community foundation in addressing them across Vermont communities with an eye on the long term? And we believe that doing so is fundamental to the long-term resilience of Vermont communities as we come out of this pandemic and we face the years ahead.
Okay, so thinking about the more than $9 million raised and $8 million granted across those strategies, among others, what keeps you up at night, Dan?
Oh, Fran, it's always an interesting question. What keeps me up at night is really three things. First is that the crisis, I think, has created some clarity. I think, across public and private, nonprofit, business, across, communities everywhere, I think we have a really strong sense of what it will take for us to be more resilient the next time a major disruption or a pandemic like this hits. I think we have some clarity around that. What keeps me up at night is the idea is that as the crisis abates, the clarity and commitment and the focus on the things that are necessary to go to work on those problems over a longer period of time, I worry that that commitment will abate and we won't make the headway that's possible in this moment of clarity. I'd be lying if the degree of violence abroad in our communities, state and nationally, wasn't something that kept me up at night. The underlying circumstances that drive race-based and hate-driven violence across the country, the crimes in Atlanta, and then the recent shooting in Colorado yesterday, the level to which our culture is accustomed to violence is something that keeps me up at night. And both because it's present, but because there are people in our country and voices that are committed to leveraging that in terms of their use of disinformation to a degree that's almost a public health crisis. And the third is a related question, which is, as we face these huge challenges, huge systemic challenges, is our civic architecture able to take on big problems and make headway on those problems? Philanthropy can only go so far. We know we can do better on these big things, but are we collectively within our civic architecture really able and willing to do what it takes to make headway on big challenges? So those are the things that keep me up at night.
Wow. So before we move on with today's session, anything else you want to add?
Fran, if people take one thing away from this session, I hope you take away a level of inspiration from the fact that Vermonters stepped up for one another in the last year in some incredible ways. We know that Vermonters look out for one another. If nothing else, the last year should be a source of inspiration based on the generosity people have shown for each other in terms of their commitments to the fund from $5 to $500,000, their ability to volunteer to bring food to their neighbors. The things we did for each other in the course of the last year are incredibly powerful. And I think at a time when the algorithms and our conversations and our public discussions seem to focus so much on the things that divide us, it's so powerful and so important to understand how we came together in response in this moment. And I think that's a really important story that to stay focused on and tell, so we know that there is a light in these moments. The Community Foundation, I think, was able to make some really good decisions really quickly, but that work was only possible because of the clear window into the direct service and the community organizations that dug in across the state. And there's an incredible debt of gratitude on our part, and I think on a statewide basis to the work of the nonprofit sector, that a debt that is owed and still accruing day by day as this response unfolds. So that I hope people take away that inspiration and a sense of gratitude for their service, and a sense of gratitude to the funders and donors, everyone who contributed to the effort to make it possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. And of course, none of the work that we're discussing today happens without an incredible community of donors and nonprofits working together, as you talked about. So let's hear from just a few of those folks about their work over the past year.
Hello, I'm Linda Johnson from Prevent Child Abuse Vermont, and this is a video thank you. When COVID first happened, we did not know how we were going to make it. We were just running as fast as we could, and then the Vermont Community Foundation became our hero.
Hi, this is Beth Rusnock with the National Life Group Foundation. Last year, when we heard that the Vermont Community Foundation was putting together a COVID-19 response fund, we definitely wanted in, because unfortunately the pandemic isn't over. The good news, though, is that when we work together with organizations like the Vermont Community Foundation and others to lift our community, to help those who are struggling, the power that we have together is far greater than what we have to do individually.
With the support of community partners like the Vermont Community Foundation, Mentor Vermont has been able to successfully lead the youth mentoring field in adapting to the new reality of the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, mentoring programs throughout Vermont have stepped up like so many other service organizations to meet the needs of their clients in new ways.
Hi, I'm Barbara Benedict, president of the J. Warren and Lois McClure Foundation. When COVID hit hard last year, the class of 2020 was especially hard hit. Their future, a big question mark. We turned to our partners at the Community College of Vermont, and we came up with a simple gift: a free college course of their choosing for any high school graduate from the class of 2020. We truly believe we succeed most when we help others succeed.
Hi, Jean.
Hey, Benji. Remember last March? What was it like launching Shift Meals?
Oh, I remember last March.
Yeah, and the Community Foundation was there right from the beginning. What was their role?
Yeah, so prior to COVID, we were in conversations with BCF about an investment from their Vermont investment pool. And when the pandemic struck, they reached out to us and they said, how can we help? With an initial grant from them, we were able to start cooking for our staff and for the immediate communities around us.
And right from the beginning, I saw how our partnership with BCF was so much more than just a grant.
Hi, my name is Dan Bridge. I'm the president and CEO of Vermont Mutual Insurance Group. In April of last year, Vermont Mutual, through our charitable giving fund, agreed to direct $1 million to COVID-19 relief right here in Vermont. But also we directed a significant amount of those monies to the Vermont Community Foundation because they could quickly put it to good use, and they did.
Hi, I'm Sharon Ellingwood, and I'm the library director at the Alice M. Ward Memorial Library in Canaan, Vermont. I would like to sincerely thank the Vermont Community Foundation for the COVID response funding and tell you a little bit about what we're doing with it. There's a bit of a broadband desert over here with both connectivity and affordability for our area residents. And we are now bringing them 100 by 100 reliable service from the library. We blasted out the front to our town center, Fletcher Park. We also have equipment to blast it out the rear of the building into the Canaan Recreation Park.
Hi, my name's Simone Rischmeyer. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Care Network with Vermont Care Partners. We have provided thousands upon thousands of telehealth services. We are in the hotels and motels. We have provided activity kits to those who are isolated at home, supports outside under tents. We have gone food shopping for people and gotten their medication and so much more. And really just want to thank the Vermont Community Foundation. Without your support, this would have been much harder to do.
Can you share 3 words that capture your experience with Shift Meals and Everyone Eats over this past year?
Yeah, solidarity, not charity. How about you?
Oh, community, resilience, and gratitude.
Our thanks to all those who participated in that inspiring video. And everyone on this call should feel a sense of pride for your part in supporting the incredible work detailed in that piece. That video, along with a recording of today's event, will be available on the Community Foundation website. I want to turn our conversation now to Jean Hamilton, Holly Morehouse, and Ted Brady, all of whom have done incredible work over the last year within their respective fields: emergency food access, the pandemic's diverse impact on youth, and the connections between community development and community resilience. After that, we'll go to a Q&A for your questions. So please submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. So panelists, we would like each of you to say a few words about the role that philanthropy played in your work over the past year, and then let our viewers know what is the top thing charitable donors can do to support your work in the year ahead. We want to start with Jean Hamilton and food systems. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, Jean currently serves many roles. She is the statewide coordinator for Everyone Eats, director of Shift Meals, and director of Impact and Mission with the Skinny Pancake, grounded by a 20-year career in Vermont's food system. It was great to see you earlier in the video, but she joins us from Plainfield today. Go ahead, Jean.
Thanks, Fran, and thanks, Dan, and welcome everyone to my office and where you saw me in the video. I've spent so much of my year right here looking at Zoom. let's see, over the last year, I've been active, as Fran said, in launching a number of COVID response programs, primarily related to food access and primarily through two related initiatives, Shift Meals and Everyone Eats. And it's hard to simplify this last year and these dynamic stories, but roughly Shift Meals launched as a local food response, providing emergency meals from the Skinny Pancake restaurant group, and our success with Shift Meals helped catalyze a larger statewide federally funded program called Vermont Everyone Eats. And VCF has been part of every stage of the Shift Meals and Everyone Eats stories, providing seed funds that you just heard about on the video, providing network connections, and strategic thought partnership that helped us develop the big picture and the big impact of our work. So starting a year ago, on March 13th, Friday, March 13th, I was evacuating an emergency flying home from what was supposed to be a very special vacation in New Orleans. And that same day, Benji Adler, who you saw in the video, was celebrating his birthday by closing all 10 of his Vermont restaurants and furloughing about 230 employees. And concerned for the safety of his staff, Benji did what entrepreneurs do best, which is to use his imagination. And he started thinking about different ways to use the restaurant's infrastructure and resources to feed the staff and to support them as they faced unknown economic crisis. VCF and High Meadows at that point reached out to Benji to see if they could help, and provided about $30,000 in seed funding. And with that, Benji was able to hire me to help launch the program. And we started making meals and really pounding the pavement to get to this idea of how can we put restaurants in Vermont back to work to help feed this overwhelming surge in Vermonters experiencing hunger and food insecurity. Pretty quickly, we were able to link up with the Vermont Food Bank and secure a contract with them to provide a higher volume of meals. And just really in short order, we're making scaling up to produce about 6,000 frozen meals a week. And just right from the outset, we really designed the project not only to serve our immediate community, but also to provide a model for other communities, and more importantly and more ideally, to provide a model that could be scaled up and supported with public dollars. And I'm really happy to say it worked. The Community Foundation connected us with other grassroots initiatives that were doing a similar concept of using restaurants to do emergency feeding. And we talked to just simply every single person we knew about it. And in June, we got our big break and were invited to present the concept to the House Commerce Committee, who was in the process of allocating out the federal stimulus money, the coronavirus relief funds. So within hours of proposing our concept to the House Committee, they were approving a bill and sending it off for a House vote. And barely a week later, the governor signed a bill that allocated $5 million to launch Everyone Eats. And courageously, the Southeastern Vermont Community Action Agency stepped right up to say that they would be able to house this program. And I'm just really overjoyed to say that by December, this brand new program had delivered $6.5 million worth of benefits across all 14 counties of the state. There are so many successes of both Shift Meals and Everyone Eats. I could literally spend all day talking about them, but I'll just do the highlights here. To date, Everyone Eats has engaged nearly 200 Vermont restaurants and have paid those restaurants $10 for every meal that they've delivered to a hungry Vermonter. These meals are provided all around the state at a variety of distribution sites that have been developed by community organizations in these communities. These distribution sites include pop-up sites, childcare centers, doctors' offices, workplaces, and even an app, a digital app created by a Burlington-based tech company called Localvore. Our communities have just been incredibly innovative in how to distribute these meals and meet community members where they need help. We thought the program would end in December when the CARES Act money expired, but I am really happy to say our roller coaster ride continues. Our partners from all across the state, from the governor's office all the way to all of our community partners, just insisted that this program had to keep going. There were too many beneficiaries to let it end. And as we approach April here and a year into the pandemic, we are approaching our millionth meal delivered, which has translated into $10 million of really critical revenue support for restaurants. On top of that, there's a local purchasing component of this program so that 10% of the ingredients that go into Vermont Everyone Eats meals are required to be purchased from Vermont farms and food producers. And because of the long work we've done in the state building a strong, viable local agricultural economy, our restaurants are purchasing more like 25% of their ingredients from local farms, and many of them are purchasing well over 70% of their ingredients from local producers. The successes of the program keep mounting. Restaurant jobs retained, local food purchased, hungry Vermonters nourished and cared for by local restaurants, meals delivered with dignity, community members uplifted from despair and energized by the opportunity to help one another. And among these successes, there have been so many lessons that we've learned, and that my lessons really reflect what I heard Dan talking about. You know, COVID has been such a crisis and really exacerbated and highlighted pre-existing crises, so pre-existing deficits and failures that were in place before this pandemic. You know, just remember that prior to COVID, 1 in 7 Vermonters were hungry. Prior to COVID, we were teetering with a globalized industrial food system that has so many consolidated risks, and so many of our workers in the food service economy are teetering on the brink of poverty. These are problems that our eyes are more open to because of COVID. And I hope we see also how vulnerable we all are under these conditions, and that we feel inspired to keep the momentum, to be creative and make real progress addressing these risks. In the face of these challenges, I think we've been able to see how the investments that we've been making in the state have really paid off. We have strong community connections. We have incredible public-private partnerships, which really paid off during our response to COVID. And what I have seen again and again this past year is an incredible willingness to reach out across silos and focus on what matters most. A lesson, a very kind of unique lesson that we've seen from Everyone Eats is the powerful impact of aligning economic development initiatives with poverty relief initiatives. And what we've seen is this incredible sense of community empowerment in this exchange, the giving and receiving of help that better supports the dignity and the self-agency of all of the participants. And I'll wrap up here that, you know, moving forward, this is what I'd really like us to consider is as we move from response to repair, you know, how do we continue to invest in a culture of innovative collaboration and resourcefulness? And how can we continue to improve and work better across silos and segregation? And how do we, as in philanthropy, build dignity and creativity and empowerment throughout our most vulnerable communities? So thanks so much for all of the work you've done and the support, and thanks, Fran. I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome, Jean. Thank you so much. An amazing program, 1 million meals. Wow. We will move on now to Holly Morehouse. She is the Executive Director of Vermont After School and the recipient of the 2017 Con Hogan Award for Creative Entrepreneurial Community Leadership. Over 2 decades, Holly's work has strengthened supports for children and youth across Vermont. Here's Holly.
Thank you, Fran. It's great to be here. This is really an exciting gathering and conversation. Like Jean and Ted and others in the opening video, I have such deep appreciation for the Vermont Community Foundation, the efforts behind the Vermont COVID Response Fund, and the contribution of all the donors to this work. At Vermont After School, I have the privilege of working for an organization that is dedicated to strengthening programs, building partnerships, and transforming communities so that all Vermont children and youth are active, engaged, connected, and heard. In my role, I get to work with youth-serving organizations across the state, and I am humbled and filled with tremendous awe and appreciation for all that these program leaders, staff, and youth development specialists strive to do, especially in this year plus of COVID, to reach and support Vermont's children and youth in that third space outside of home and school. This pandemic has definitely challenged us all, but the emotional impact for our youth is especially significant. Just at a time when everything they are, biologically, developmentally, and socially, is supposed to be about connecting with peers, figuring out who they want to be, building a sense of identity, and experiencing growing independence. Many have been cut off, isolated, and lonely. We hear the stories about young people spending 8 to 10 hours on the computer with school and homework every day, about them missing friends, about not having access to the experiences that feed their souls, like theater, dance, music, scouts, teams, clubs, and more. According to recent data collected in partnership with a number of Vermont communities through the Vermont Youth Project, we know that in October 2020, 38% of responding youth in grades 7 through 12 reported that they sometimes or often felt difficulties were piling up so high that they could not overcome them. 45% of participating high schoolers said that COVID has made their mental health worse. And when you dig into that data, they're concerned not only about their own mental health, but about the mental health of those around them. 47% of high schoolers reported that COVID has worsened school connections. Over half of participating 11th and 12th graders said that they are lonelier due to COVID. 57% said that it hurt their educational experience, and 48% felt more anxious. And here's one that really gets to me. Over 1/3, 35% of all participating youth reported having sleeping problems. So at this critical moment in time, young people need to feel safe and supported to re-engage in learning and to recover from this period of loss and isolation. They need not only academic support, but also social and emotional support. They need help sustaining and rebuilding relationships, talking about their experiences and emotions, developing as leaders and agents of change, and re-engaging with their interests. This is an area where private philanthropy can and really has had a positive impact this year. The Vermont COVID-19 Response Fund helped to expand access to after-school programs for children and youth in communities across the state. These after-school programs are serving a critical role throughout COVID in keeping kids healthy and safe and fed, supporting learning and engagement, and helping working families. Through the fund, we were also able to provide operational dollars to youth centers and teen centers in Vermont. Often overlooked, youth centers are vital spaces to many young people, serving meals, hosting outdoor programming and events, creating leadership opportunities, offering enriching activities, and supporting connections with friends and mentors. Finally, the support helped to strengthen the incredible field of youth development specialists that make up this varied and rich landscape of third space programming in Vermont. In the recently passed America Rescue Plan, there are more federal dollars coming to Vermont to support after school and summer programming. And I can't tell you how excited we are about what that can mean for our children, youth, and families. But I would argue that this is not a time for private philanthropy to step back. Rather, it's a critical moment. It's a critical juncture to step forward and make sure that what gets shaped over the next 6, 12, or 18 months is what is most needed and most effective in Vermont communities. While federal dollars tend to flow to agencies and institutions, private philanthropy can reach directly to the people and local organizations who have those close relationships with youth and who are nimble and creative and can work alongside young people to create the opportunities, programs, and experiences that they need most. And private donors can do it with an immediacy that recognizes that a year to a young person is very, very different than a year to me as an adult. You know, for a 16-year-old, it's 1/16 of their young life and a quarter of their high school experience. You know, it's a year they won't get back. And it's a year that should be full of milestones, memories, and important opportunities for growth and development. So I don't think we can wait, right? Like, these are spaces where I hope we will all focus our attention right now. And summer is a time to dig into this work. This year, more than ever, we need summer 2021 to be one of connection, of healing, and of learning of all types for our children and youth. You know, this summer should be about fun times with friends, program staff, and mentors, opportunities for creative engagement and expression, healthy meals, daily physical activity, outdoor adventures in our beautiful state, career exploration and job opportunities for older youth, and projects that allow young people to explore and learn, to go through that re-engagement process and move out into the world again. So thank you so much for your support this year. I look forward to working with all of you to make sure that Vermont's children and youth have opportunities to be active, engaged, connected, and heard. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Holly. I'd like to remind our viewers that we hope to have a few minutes to answer your questions for Jean, Holly, or Ted, who's about to come up. So feel free to submit them via the Q&A tab. So now on to Ted Brady, who has a number of prominent leadership roles on his resume. He is currently the Deputy Secretary of Vermont's Agency of Commerce and Community Development, which works to grow Vermont's economy, create jobs, and supports vibrant and resilient communities and affordable housing. Welcome, Ted. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Fran. It's great to be with the Vermont Community Foundation today and with Fran. I feel like I'm on a PBS special. She always does such a great job. So first, about the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. Many of you may not know who we are. We're the branch of government. We like to think that we are the revenue side of the equation for the government. We actually build new revenue by making our communities more vibrant, by attracting businesses, by attracting visitors, and by building housing here in Vermont, thus growing our tax base. We're consisted of 3 departments: the Tourism and Marketing Department, which speaks for itself, Department of Economic Development, which attracts businesses and grows Vermont businesses to create the jobs of the future, and the Department of Housing and Community Development, which really focuses on downtowns and planning, regional planning, and of course, administering some federal dollars. Administering dollars, that's a big piece of what the Agency of Commerce and Community Development does. So that's our big partnership with you. We have a lot of smart people at the agency who administer these programs. We have a lot of smart people at the agency who try to innovate with these programs. Give you a flavor, our annual budget's about $35 million a year. We run the Housing and Urban Development Federal Block Grant Program, which thanks to our congressional delegation, brings Vermont about $7 million, half of which uses affordable housing, half goes to economic development. Our downtown tax credit program and federal historic tax credit programs bring about $5 million a year to our state each year. The Northern Border Regional Commission, which has rapidly grown an economic development program that now brings Vermont about $8 million a year. That's our typical year. Thanks to the insane last 12 months that everyone has spoken about so far, the agency ended up administering close to $200 million in economic recovery money through the federal Corona Relief Fund. This $200 million went to more than a dozen different programs, everything from feeding the hungry to helping pay people's mortgages, to helping landlords, to help rehabilitate housing, to help market Vermont. And the largest share of it went into the pockets of Vermont businesses that were struggling. Hospitality businesses, restaurants, people who had to close. More than $100 million of that $200 million actually went directly into the pockets of those businesses. So the question, I think, comes through COVID or any other time: how does philanthropy direct our money and our time? When I step back to, I want to talk about what our money can be used for or is predominantly used for. I think of any project, any initiative, any special thing that we all work on together to make Vermont a better place. I think of it as having 4 distinct phases. Every good project starts with an idea, and that idea could be in a citizen, it could be in a funder, could be in a government official, or it could be coming from private enterprise. And that ideation phase can take years, decades, God knows, months, in some cases days. There's very little federal and state money available for that phase. And it's where we really look to philanthropy to help those people come up with those great ideas and bring them to the next phase, which is really capacity. From that idea needs capacity. Somebody needs to take the idea and turn it into something actionable. And that's another place where there just isn't money to fund capacity at the state and federal level. Then we get to the fun parts, which are true planning, the 3rd phase, and implementation. And planning and implementation money generally can be found in state and federal government pretty easily. If you have a good idea that has capacity, you're going to find planning money and you're going to find implementation money. So I think when we look at where philanthropy and state and federal government have come together in this past year, it's that you folks, the Vermont Community Foundation, the fund, as well as individual philanthropic givers, have driven ideas and capacity to a point where we were ready to implement some really neat ideas with the influx of federal dollars. And I should point out the limited ideation and capacity that we do have. Here's a dirty secret about state and federal government. We don't like risk. And we really need somebody to validate the limited resources we have. And that's where philanthropic giving comes in. When we see something attached to the Vermont Community Foundation, when that stamp of approval goes in a project, I, as an administrator at a state agency, say to my staff, you have the right now to go and work on that project. Even though it might be a $20,000 grant on a $10 million idea, I feel better dedicating my staff's time to a project that the Vermont Community Foundation, that private philanthropy has already put a dime into, even if it's not much, because it just, the limited idea time and capacity time I have, I dedicate to those projects. So how did that manifest itself in the last year? I want to use 3 examples. Example 1, Gene already talked about it, but Everyone Eats is the textbook example of how philanthropic giving can drive the state to do something it might not otherwise do. The idea of shift meals and what Benji was doing and having private philanthropy interested in that project allowed that concept to explode. That idea was bubbling in 10 different places. Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman takes credit for it. The Sustainable Jobs Fund takes credit for it. My agency takes credit for it. There are people in public safety that take credit for it. What a gift, right? That means this great idea has all these parents, and we needed somebody to actually raise the thing. And that's what philanthropic giving did. It raised the thing so it was ready for prime time, so we could all say, hey, I had this idea, but I didn't have anybody actually working on it. And when Everyone Eats, as Gene just talked about, went into the committee, it was so easy to make that great thing happen. I shouldn't say that because it's taken so many hours of people's times, but it was so easy to fund that thing, thanks to private giving. That's an easy example. Another good example, the Better Places Partnership. Let me tell you what the Better Places Partnership is. We recognize through the last 18 to 24 months that our downtowns and villages need some resources to help them do programming, to help bring people downtown. And it doesn't take a lot of resources. We're not talking about water, sewer, broadband, rehabbing town halls. We're talking about little things. Things like investing in an amphitheater in your downtown. Things like food truck areas in your downtown. Things like what Bethel's done with Bethel University. The idea of doing some public art, something that attracts people downtown, or maybe just holding some special event. And so 18 months ago, Better Places starts percolating through Chris Cochran, Gary Holloway, Jacob Hemrick, and Rich Namori in our office. Conversation with the Vermont Community Foundation, with the National Life Foundation. Go down that long list of other philanthropic givers. They authorized the agency to continue working on this project. In 6 months, the pandemic hits, and we're struggling to find money. We proposed money in the budget last year without any luck. Today, I'm sitting here thanks to philanthropic giving, which kept this project going. And despite the fact that we couldn't get state dollars for the project, just announced $130,000 of initiatives in places like White River Junction and places like Northfield to do things like pocket parks, to do things like public art in Wilmington. We just announced $130,000 because of philanthropic giving. And now we're on the precipice of being included in the budget for another $5 million to blow this program large. So those are just 2 good examples. I'll skip the third one because I'm out of time, and we have time later. I'll bring it up. So thanks so much for including the Agency of Commerce and Community Development.
Awesome, Ted. Thank you so much. And we will come back to that if we can, but stay on here. I'd like to ask actually all of our panelists one thing, and then we'll be sort of caught up. But if you could travel back in time to March 13th, 2020, I think many of us remember this. What is the one thing you would tell yourself about the year ahead? Gene, I see that you're on, so why don't you take a stab at that?
Sure. I know a year ago I was, as I said, I had just flown home from New Orleans and was in a panic, like so many of us, and just really filled with anxiety about what was going to happen and were we going to sink into apocalypse. And this past year has just been the opposite. It's been a year of incredible community abundance. And as Dan said, people really rising up together and helping each other with what they have. And I feel like getting all teary thinking about it, but just I would like to tell myself a year ago that we have each other and we are loving and caring people. And we should lean into that and trust our neighbors and trust our instincts to care for one another.
Awesome, Jean. And Holly, what would you tell yourself about the year ahead?
Well, Fran, first, Jean, so well said. I would tell myself how important it is to stay in the conversation, right? That moving through a global pandemic, we're not going to get it right the first time. But to stay in the conversation, keep those in the field in the conversation, keep that communication and that connection going. Don't be afraid to make some noise when something's not right, because we got to fix it. And then lastly, something that we've been doing this whole year is there have been, right, so many moments of struggle and angst and challenge, but there's also been what we're calling the COVID miracles. And so I would tell myself to watch for the COVID miracles. And those are those people, those connections, those things that prior to March of 2020, I never would have thought, right, would have happened in the way they did. So I've really appreciated those this year.
Thanks, Holly. And Ted, back to you. You could give your example if you want, or what you would tell yourself a year ago about the year ahead. We've got a minute before we need to move on.
There are no rules. That's what I would have told myself. I wish I could have told you how many times we sat there and said, we can't do that. We can't give we can't give grants directly to businesses. We can't spend 5 times as much as our normal tourism budget in 6 months. We can't stand up a program to give landlords assistance in paying their rent, all these things. There are no rules. So we should have been more creative from the get-go, and maybe we could have done even more good.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We, to all of you, stay tuned. There might be some Q&A near the end of the program if we have time. So thank you all for being on this panel and adding so much for all of us this year. So I want to bring the conversation back home to the Community Foundation and speak with Sarah Waring and Stacy Fagan about what they've learned over the past year of pandemic and grant making and how those insights can inform grant making over the next year. Let's start with Sarah. She's the Vice President of Grants and Community Investment. Sarah, Ted just talked about the role of philanthropy that philanthropy can play in seeding community resilience. And earlier, Dan spoke about how the 5 recovery initiatives are fundamental to building a more resilient future. So why these 5 initiatives? Oh, we can't hear you.
There we go.
There we go.
All right, thank you. It's a great question. And I think to answer the question, we knew that we had to start with the realities that we inherited before the pandemic began. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, for the past 12 years, both median household income and hourly wages in Vermont have been virtually stagnant. We also know that our economic growth, going back to the 2008 recession, lagged behind the US at about 11% compared to 22% across the country. 60,000 of us before the pandemic were in poverty, and we don't know how many will be there after COVID begins to wrap up. 70,000 of us received food assistance, and this was at least tripled in this last year. There were also 60,000 households without adequate internet access in 2019. And then if you look at these statistics, but you look at them across gender and race and ethnic demographics, we also know that women and children and people of color were disproportionately at the bottom. So we asked ourselves, if we're going to transform to a more resilient Vermont, we will have to address these systemic conditions and others. So why would our 5 areas, connectivity, entrepreneurship, food systems, education, and equity, help to address these conditions? And the answer really was simple. The focus areas help to change something fundamental for Vermont families or businesses or communities, and they provide some stability. But they also paint a picture of a new ruralism for Vermont, one that is vibrant and full of opportunity and healthy and hopeful and diverse. Our recovery initiatives could be this, the foundation for this new ruralism. So we chose them because they felt fundamental to the future. Without affordable high-speed internet access, we would leave behind families and school children and businesses in rural and underserved areas, and we can't leave them behind. So we funded communication union districts, rural libraries, and others to help prepare for a future when everyone could engage online. Also, we can't recover from this recession unless we support startup and new and growing businesses. We need an environment that makes it easy to start and build and maintain a business and then provide jobs for Vermonters. So we funded a network of business incubators and technical assistance and more. We need the young people in Vermont not to lose hope or direction. And Holly's statistics are really sobering. We wanted to make sure that they would see their own path to education or technical skills, and we wanted to lower the barriers for them to get there. So we supported early college and new spots for career training. We supported early care sector professional development, among many other initiatives. And we wouldn't be Vermont without our farmers and our working lands enterprises. So we need those enterprises to thrive, but we also need them to feed hungry Vermonters the next time there's a big storm or a crisis. So we supported these regional food system resilience projects and food hubs and food pantries and more. And then finally, without communities that are prepared to work on the issues of racial and social justice, discrimination, white supremacy, we will keep alienating and marginalizing people of color or Indigenous communities who would like to make Vermont their home and feel safe and feel like they belong. So we funded Black and Brown-led organizations and initiatives, community building work, local and school leadership to address equity. And we feel like all of these together show us the way for rural America and rural Vermont to be stronger.
Absolutely. And so now the big question, how can charitable individuals build on that strategy?
That's my favorite question, Fran. So we've been so lucky all along this year to work with so many incredible partners and funders. And we are going to continue to track trends and work alongside some of these statewide partners and projects that you've heard about. And we're going to continue to be data-driven. But what this means for philanthropists is that they could work alongside us by thinking locally, like Holly shared. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Folks could always continue to keep an eye on urgent needs. So while our new federal funding package is designed differently and hopefully will meet the needs of more people who are hungry or people who are without employment, there's always more to do. And folks could look at food pantries and food shelves. The VCF is working to ensure that programs that support farmers and food workers, as well as neighbors most in need, are all resourced. But can you find a program that's local that connects local food to food security systems? Or think the same way about your library or a teen center or a summer camp and their roles right now to support and connect our neighbors. You can also, though, think long-term the same way VCF has done. If you look at organizations who are envisioning the future, this is an important next step around capacity building. So many nonprofits are having a hard time even keeping their doors open, but some have the capacity to think about how this disruption can be a chance to envision the future differently. For example, look at your local school and municipal leadership. The VCF is working statewide to help support cultural awareness and anti-racism and resources for school and local leaders. Is there a chance for you to do the same in your district? Or you could think about organizations working toward economic strength and the identity of a community. These are like the Due North in Lyndonville or Space on Main in Bradford, Launch VT or the Generator in Chittenden, who do support services for businesses and make entry easy. And then there are community hubs, arts and culture organizations, places like the Arnold Block in Bethel, Catamount Arts in the Northeast Kingdom, the Clemens Family Farm, that bring people together. They share assets, they share resources, and they create identity in Vermont at a local level. So basically, it's our position right now to be able to think about the whole state and to work with statewide partners. but every dollar counts, and the small grants in your backyard are also very important.
Absolutely. So how will that $1.9 trillion COVID-19 stimulus advance these recovery initiatives? And how will that impact philanthropy in Vermont?
Yeah, well, this is the $2.7 billion question, Fran, that we have right now. We are getting at this stage a sector by sector breakdown of how the American Rescue Plan Act is going to play out. But there are a few things that are distinct about the American Rescue Plan compared to the Coronavirus Relief Fund. First, there's a focus on families, things like direct aid, rental assistance, aid to the unemployed, childcare, energy assistance, and so on. There's also going to be support for infrastructure and tax incentives and aid to businesses. There will be support for young people, both through schools and through literacy programs and more. And the federal package includes critical areas of well-being, like support for mental health to address the trauma and the grief of this last year. And then aid is going to go to testing sites, vaccine sites, and the rollout to help solve the public health crisis. But one important thing in this package is that there's a focus on access and equity. This administration is attempting to better serve historically marginalized people across all sectors. And this one is all about timing. There's much more time for our legislature to determine where to direct these funds, and that's important. The impacts of the pandemic will last for some time, and we have a few years to spend the money. But the urgency right now for many of us is the shift in the public health crisis. And I'll give you a quick example of what I mean. Restaurants and businesses and communities lost a lot of revenue last year because of seasonal income that they might have had from visitation. If we can immunize up to 80% of Vermonters by the time this summer rolls around, we could not only have safe summer camps and events back up and running, but this summer's economic activity could make or break many of our community businesses, particularly those that were just able to hold on last year. So what's clear to me is no matter how direct these federal relief efforts get, there is always a role for the nimble, flexible, and innovative funding that philanthropy can provide. We've partnered, funded soft costs and collaboration, and we've had a chance to think outside some of the silos of government agencies and existing grant programs. And it feels true that it's a pretty critical role in the vision for the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I see that some questions are coming in. Feel free to go to the Q&A box and add yours for Sarah and Stacy. We will get to some Q&As after Stacy has given her, after I talk to her for a bit. I'd like to bring her on. She's the Vice President of Philanthropy, and we want to hear what she's noticed over this last year. So Stacy, Sarah mentioned, of course, the federal stimulus and how the foundation can help people navigate gaps in that funding. I'm guessing that's one of the reasons why fund holders work with you.
Well, Fran, nice to see you this afternoon. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. I think the answer to that, Fran, is yes, eventually. Although generally I'd say, donors turn to the Community Foundation because they want to have an impact with their giving. What exactly that impact looks like over time becomes more visible as they become more familiar with what we do and how we do it as a foundation. In the case of COVID-19 donors, that urge to give and to be responsive was about helping neighbors and showing up in community and looking for a place that could deploy those resources really quickly. And they turned their support to the Community Foundation COVID-19 fund, I think initially because they wanted to work with a partner who had the experience and the visibility to community needs. But what I think is less visible is how the foundation looks for ways to make charitable dollars go, what I call go the distance. And some of this is what you've already heard from our wonderful friends on the panel today, including Sarah, Ted, and Jean, and Holly, which is the ways in which philanthropic dollars provide that bridge or they fill a gap that is not yet covered by federal funding, as was the case early on with the CARES Act, when grants from the COVID fund provided for charitable food, PPE, cleaning supplies, or in the case of seed funding. And we've heard a lot about shift meals and Everyone Eats, but that's a perfect example of where we see the importance of philanthropy and the opportunity for philanthropy. But I think it's probably not one of those things people see at the outset. And so the answer to your question, Fran, is, well, not always the first thing that people realize about the work that we can do together at the foundation. We do want donors and fund holders to see that whether we're in a pandemic or not, that we can be a partner for them in helping to achieve some impact. There's just so much good that we can do when we come together.
Absolutely. So after a year of working with donors on COVID-19, what surprises you? Is many surprises, but what comes top of mind?
Yes, well, that's right. So many things, Fran. It's been a year of unprecedented uncertainty, learning, generosity. But I think three things in particular stand out for me. So pace of learning and the adjustment of philanthropy since last year, the scale and the scope of the impact of the COVID-19 fund, and ingenuity. And I'll take each of those separately, but really the pace of learning and the adjustment of philanthropy since March of last year, I think is astounding to me. Fund holders and donors responded boldly and immediately. They regulated their philanthropy in response to the pandemic. And as a point of reference, in the March-April period last year, our donor advised fund holders granted out more than $2.4 million directly to nonprofits, which is $1 million more than for the same period in 2019. And then on top of that, the COVID fund received more than $1 million in donations. Beyond COVID support, fund holders and donors also turned their grant making to racial justice and equity, civic engagement, economic inequality, childcare. You can imagine that list got longer as the year progressed. But what was surprising and uplifting was to see donors and philanthropy generally being malleable and responsive to so many priorities at once. I'm holding this as the bright spot of COVID, the silver linings that Holly mentioned, that together, we were able to make significant shifts in our habits and our norms in philanthropy because we kept holding that question of what is the impact that we are hoping to achieve. And as a result, the foundation and its fund holders, I think, really seized the opportunity to pursue giving practices that were more effective at achieving impact. And I think we're really keen to see which of those we can carry forward. So second, the scale and scope of the COVID-19 fund, it continues to really surprise and delight me. The fund has had a tremendous impact in all the ways that you've heard from Sarah and Dan over the last hour, and which is made possible from the generosity and trust of both our BCF donor advised fund holders and the donors from across Vermont and the country. In total, more than 600 donors have given more than $9 million to the COVID fund to date. From the very first call to one of our fund holders last March, on which we asked them to seed the COVID fund, donors have said yes without hesitation, and they have been enormously generous. Gifts come from across the state around New England and from as far away as California and Washington. Donors at all levels and of all types have made the COVID fund what it is. That's the $5 donor who has made a $5 gift to the fund every month since last March. The Vermont Chinese School, who early on held a fundraiser and contributed $1,400 to the fund. The young man from Boston who sent in a wonderful note and a gift in honor of his second home community in Vermont. And of course, a wonderfully generous fund holder who made a 7-figure gift to the fund. So a lot of surprises in that category of the COVID fund. But also, I would say in the delight category, what I was inspired by was to learn from donors the reasons that they supported the COVID-19 fund. We, of course, know the value of a statewide effort, but not everybody does. And I think what we heard from our donors to the fund was that they really wanted to support the areas of greatest need. And we know that those shifted quite a lot over the last year. And so they were able to achieve a lot of impact by giving to the COVID fund as those needs shifted. They were also able to support a community outside of their own the ones in which they're less familiar, that perhaps have less philanthropic capital than the ones where they live. And they were also inspired by the strategy of the fund to make both grants for urgent needs and for recovery. And then I think the last thing that comes to mind, Fran, is this idea of ingenuity. You know, ingenuity pops up for me in relation to one of the projects that we lifted up in Southern Vermont with a small group of donors who approached the foundation with $1 million to support a small business relief program. And, you know, this is not something the foundation typically does. You know, Ted referenced the idea of there are no rules. There are certainly a loosening of those rules under the declaration from the governor of the state of emergency. And we were really able to make this happen with a partner at the Bank of Bennington. And as a result, 55 businesses received grants ranging from $4,000 to $30,000. And these were folks who are ineligible for other relief funds and were considered particularly vulnerable. Folks from the restaurant sector, from the service and wellness industry, from small lodgings, retail shops, artisans, etc. And of course, these grants had a tremendous impact on businesses themselves. But I think what was really heartwarming was to hear how it impacted grantees personally. What we heard from them is that they felt seen and supported by their community, and they're inspired to give back when they can. So in the midst of so much uncertainty, I think there's a lot to celebrate in both in the level and scale of philanthropy, the generosity of those who care about Vermonters, and the ways in which together we supported the most vulnerable during this time. So the surprises for me, Fran, or the bright spots that stay with me are the ingenuity of the foundation, the generosity of our donors, and how we see grantees wanting to pay it forward.
Absolutely. And so what now? What's at top of mind now as we are seeing a different, hopefully a different future?
Yeah, I think, you know, in addition to being so grateful to have come so far, I think the biggest question in my mind is how can we hold the important lessons learned and carry them forward? You've heard from my colleagues on this panel just how much there is to do going forward. The impacts of the pandemic are far from over, and we have a lot to do together. So, you know, when I say lessons learned, I mean things like which practices will we as funders and donors be willing to let go of? The sort of the rules that Ted mentioned, such as restricted giving or single year giving, and which will we embrace, like collective giving, capacity building, or strategic plan funding for nonprofits. You know, collective giving or pooled giving is something that typically really peaks in times of crisis. Funders come together really in an unprecedented way during these times, and yet the power of this type of coordinated funding really cannot be understated as a model for impact every day. You know, as an example, one of the recovery initiatives that we've talked about today a lot is the rural connectivity, and you know, a focused investment to help bridge the digital divide. And we had certainly many donors to the COVID Fund asking how their gift, the COVID Fund, could really make a difference in a sector that is so vast and so much at scale. And the answer to that is, of course, they can have a huge difference. You know, this power of pooled giving is really almost limitless. It allows us to really achieve a level of investment. Again, as you've heard my colleagues say, to make multi-year grants, to pilot new models, to seed new ideas, and to make some big bets. So when I think about the future, we really want charitable dollars to go the distance, and we invite our donors and our friends to continue to stay with us as we think about what comes next.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we have a little bit of time for a Q&A before we, as we wrap up, or just before the wrap up. One request has been to recap the 5 initiatives. And Sarah, is that something that you can do for us?
Sure, absolutely. Rural connectivity, which is about equitable access to affordable high-speed internet, and that's gonna be a long piece of work. rural entrepreneurship, which is about creating the business environment for small businesses to help us accelerate out of this recession that we are in. Food system resilience, which is both about the connection between the local food system and the food security system. And it's about capturing this moment for our Vermont producers to hold on to the markets that have really emerged during COVID for many of their products. Welcoming equitable anti-racist communities, about Vermont culture of welcoming and belonging, like Dan said, and all of the ripple impacts that that is going to have for us, workforce development, education, community, et cetera. And then learners in transition, which is really about the moment in time and the inspiration and the hope for continuing your pathway, young people in particular, displaced workers also, for technical or continuing education.
Okay, great. And maybe you can take this one too. So why don't you hang in there? Could you comment, this question came in a little bit ago. Could you comment on the importance of sustainability in the how we approach these solutions, especially as we look to a radically better approach on how we treat the environment?
It's a great question. I'm going to answer it by saying a little bit more about the last 4 or 5 years of the Community Foundation's opportunity gap focus. One of the theoretical concepts that we really use to do our strategic grant making is a look at systems and at systems change. And what I mean by that is that we talked about those conditions on the ground that existed for Vermonters. And what our team does and what the Community Foundation does is to try to look for levers within the system that could be shifted so that those conditions on the ground change. So when we think about sustainability and when we think about the environment, in particular, these are really interesting ways for us to look at this work. Who's involved at the table? What are some of those long-term, maybe ecological feedback loops that we don't normally think of as being part of the system? But certainly when we think about climate change, climate mitigation, climate migration, various other things that are coming on the horizon, having a long-term view and a systems level view is going to be really important for us in the how, in the sustainability.
Terrific. And while we've got you up, and I want both you and Stacy to answer this, but because I asked Dan to let us know what keeps him up at night. What about you, Sarah?
Well, beside my 16-month-old who keeps me up at night sometimes, I think the thing that keeps me up the most is the need across Vermont. Philanthropy is not huge, and especially when compared with our government partners, as Ted mentioned. So I think a lot about the health and well-being and the sustainability, back to that question, of our key on-the-ground partners. There are so many people who are working every day to make a difference, and many of them have scaled up in this last year. They've added staff, they've added programs, and I am worried about how much we can be there and for how long. And I am worried about which challenges will be taken up by public funding or policy or other leadership. Because philanthropy can be a catalyst and it can be a stopgap, but its role in base funding for community services is really hard to maintain. So that's part of what worries me.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And you, Stacy, what keeps you up at night?
You know, I love this question. I think it's that we will, I think that we will fall back into the sort of habits of creating rules. I love the way Ted phrased it as he did earlier, because rules are sometimes very arbitrary, sort of the norms, I think, that I was referencing in terms of our practices and how we utilize philanthropy, and we create boundaries around it. And I'm excited by the last year in the ways in which we have sort of released ourselves from some of those restrictions. And so I think what keeps me up at night is that we'll fall back to that place. And when we've learned so much, and I think we've really come so far as individual philanthropists as well as organizational funders. And so I hope that we'll lean in, we'll continue to test each other and test our assumptions on that front.
Okay. Sarah, I want to come back to you with the 5 initiatives did you consider other areas that charitable Vermonters should keep an eye on? I mean, not that 5 isn't enough, but are there others?
It felt like a lot last year. It did. It felt like a lot. Yeah, absolutely. In developing what comes next, there are a few key things that we are thinking about, but there is one that maybe underlies many of them, and I'll take climate change and our coming climate crisis as an example. If people give up and accept current conditions and sort of accept that we can't solve big problems, we will continue to run into global challenges that affect us here in Vermont. Climate change, as the example, would affect all parts of Vermont: ski industries and tourism and maple sugaring and farming and our communities and migration from folks coming to Vermont. But to engage in that level of complex problem solving, we need citizens who are civically engaged. We need people to be thinking about the long-term health and well-being of their communities and who are willing to step up and be a part of solutions. So we really believe that civic engagement is vital. I think we have to use this disruption as a way to keep people energized and excited and participating in the future of their communities. So that's something we're going to be keeping on our eye on.
Okay, great. Another one just came in and it asks, will VCF continue to consider new models of granting to Vermont-based organizations, specifically thinking about new and higher levels of grant payouts, multi-year commitments, and prioritizing overly impacted disenfranchised communities like LGBTQ+ and youth?
Yeah, and I can take that one as well. Okay, sure, absolutely. Multi-year payments and supporting vulnerable populations have been at the center of some of our opportunity gap work. We have done that with our regional and local impact grants. We've done that with our cornerstone grants. We're going to continue to do that. The real question is, how much more can we do it? I will tell you that the fund holders who have supported the discretionary grant rounds, which is something that the VCF gets to take leadership on, were so important for us this year because we were able to be so much more flexible with those dollars. It was an incredible gift. So the quick answer is yes, we're leaning in even further with the opportunity gap work and focus areas, and many of the flexible grant making strategies that we used early on last year, we are hoping to continue going forward.
Okay, thank you so much. And with that, we're just about out of time. Thank you both, Stacy and Sarah. Wonderful clarification and almost overwhelming, wonderful bits of information. But before I hand it back to Dan to close us out, a few housekeeping notes. Please take a minute to fill out the survey that appears when you log off this webinar. It really helps us plan for future events. Also, watch your inbox for email that includes a one-page summary of the key takeaways from today's events. And lastly, as we've noted all along, this is the first in a series of Insight Hub events. So we hope you will join us again in the future. The Insight Hub has many more events planned, so keep an eye out for those invitations. You can visit vermontcf.org/insighthub to sign up for those emails to make sure you do not miss out. So thank you all so much. And now back to Dan.
Thanks again, Fran. And I want to thank all of our panelists and Sarah and Stacy for their thoughts on the year that we've just been through. Jean, Holly, and Ted, your comments are incredibly helpful and incredibly insightful. Just a few key takeaways as we think about this. Again, I encourage everybody to think, I hope leave today with a sense of inspiration around the connectivity that exists across Vermont and the connection and the support that communities and community members have offered to each other in this moment. But some of the things we just heard, first, we're not done yet. We're not done yet. We still have work to do. And the sense that we need to be creative, ingenuity is important. Jean said the idea of innovative collaboration Ted's comment, there are no rules. I'm glad our compliance person wasn't on the phone, but the reality is, I mean, there's a lot we can do to disrupt the orthodoxies that have informed both our work as a philanthropy and a community foundation, but there's work more broadly to challenge some of the orthodoxies that informed our thinking and our approach to systems that hold conditions in place. Every good project starts with an idea. I love that. And the Insight Hub is really a mechanism by which we hope that collectively, as we listen and research and engage and work together to improve Vermont communities over the course of the coming years, those good ideas and those practices and that insight comes together in a format that allows philanthropy to coordinate and be responsive and really sustain the momentum we feel right now around the big issues that are faced in Vermont communities. So again, closing with gratitude for the incredible year we've been through, the partnership on the part of funders and philanthropists and donors, and on the part of the nonprofit sector and the direct service organizations, and all who've made the lives of their neighbors better and more manageable over the course of this year. Just thank you. And we look forward to our work together ahead.